including the role of the CFO in driving the committee's success. The Audit Committee is so important more than ever today, so I hope you find today's topic timely. We have 4 experienced FLG partners with us today to help us navigate this important topic. Each of them have served on at least one private or public company board, and several have been Audit Committee chairs. Mark Murray is a life science CFO, and he is on the board at Oyster Point Pharma. Jeff Kuhn, a co-founder and administrative partner at FLG, is currently on the board and chair of the Audit Committee of Skyline Enterprises. He has also served on a number of other private boards. Ron Fior has been a public company CFO advising management teams and boards in the technology sector for over 3 decades. Ken Chow is a technology CFO and currently sits on the board at ModCam AM, a developer of IOT visual systems. And myself, who will facilitate today, I'm currently the audit chair of a biopharma company, and I have served on 4 public healthcare company boards and served as audit chair at 2 of them. Before we begin, please note that you can place any questions in the chat, and what we'll do is we'll address them at the end of the session, okay? So with no further ado, let's begin. So our first topic of discussion today, everyone, is the importance of the Audit Committee chair. And with that, we're going to be having our discussion with Mark Murray. Welcome, Mark. You've advised a number of boards about Audit Committee chair priorities. What do you believe are the top 3 most important issues for the chair to discuss, to focus on?
Thanks, Lorraine. I would point to 3 critical items for the Audit Committee chair. The first, of course, is to lead the Audit Committee by meeting its obligations that are going to be stated in the committee charter. The second is to oversee risk and crisis management, including the ability to anticipate, identify, and mitigate any type of exposure. Lastly, the Audit Committee chair can be a strong mentor to the CFO. I might also add there are a number of common attributes that are characteristics for an effective chair. Being a financial expert, of course, under the NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange rules, setting the right tone in the committee that we will do the right things, we'll do it with integrity, we're going to have open and transparent communications within the committee, that we value diversity and thought and experiences on the committee, and of course, the chair should be a great listener.
Totally. Those are excellent point marks. You mentioned the Audit Committee charter. Can you tell us a little bit more on what the charter of the Audit Committee should cover?
Yes, the Audit Committee charter will typically lay out responsibilities to the company, the full board, and shareholders. And I like to think of it covering at least 4 critical elements. The chair's leadership is going to be critical in implementing these elements. The first element I like to start with is setting the direction and agenda for the committee. This includes setting the right tone, the expectation, and work effort of the committee, and can be accomplished by mapping out the committee's agenda for at least the next 12 months that ensures meeting the responsibilities outlined in the charter. I've done this several times, both as an audit chair as well as a sitting CFO, by creating a matrix that lays out the committee's responsibility on one axis and lists the dates for the audit committee on the other axis. Recently, as audit chair, I utilized this matrix for a company. They had just gone public. They had just adopted its first audit committee charter and just brought in a new and first-time CFO. So having this matrix allowed me to set expectations, plan milestones, and proactively prepare the workflow for the CFO, their team, as well as the audit committee. Finally, evaluating the committee's effectiveness through a self-evaluation that should be honest, constructive, and insightful, and it needs to lead to a plan for continuous improvement. I would do these evaluations at least once a year. The second area of the charter that is sometimes overlooked is audit committee composition. Diversity of skills, experience, and perspectives really matter. Not everyone needs to be a financial expert, but having individuals with legal, regulatory, quality, or other operational experiences can fill out any potential blind spots. The audit committee chair should also provide for continuous education of its members, as well as succession planning for the committee members. Finally, having the right size of the audit committee is important. I like starting at 3 members, and you can go up from there, but you should balance the need for skills and experience on one hand versus keeping the committee productive on the other hand. The third key element for the audit committee charter lays out how the committee will coordinate with other major stakeholders and should include internal, external audit, as well as management and the full board. Fourth and finally, you always want timely and transparent communications between the audit committee and the full board. This will include regularly reporting to the full board in a clear and unambiguous way the committee's findings, results, and recommendations. And ideally, you want those views to be supported by the full committee.
Thanks so much, Mark. Those 4 priorities are so key for the audit chair to be most effective. So let's move on now to your second critical item as an audit committee chair, and that is managing risk. Tell us a little bit about that.
I like to think about the audit committee's role is overseeing risk in 3 ways. Specifically, you need to focus on the ability to anticipate, identify, and mitigate the related exposure. Typically, the chair should ensure that the committee covers a number of risk exposures that can include everything from physical risk, such as fire, flood, earthquakes, and of course, pandemics, as we've all been living, as well as regulatory, IP, cybersecurity risk, and the potential for fraud. My partner, Jeff Kuhn, will be covering each of these in more detail shortly.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So now we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about what is your last critical item for an audit chair to focus on, and that is how they can help mentor a CFO. I know this is one of your favorite subjects, so tell us your thinking here.
Yes, this is a favorite area for me personally, as I find it a way to get back, as some of my best mentors have been audit committee chairs. I've mentored and coached several CFOs and found such mentoring is critical for a first-time CFO. And for the more experienced CFO, you become more of a resource or counsel for that experienced CFO to consult with. There are a number of ways that a chair can help mentor a CFO, and it helps if the chair has previously been a sitting CFO, as experience truly matters. Modeling and providing feedback on the right executive attributes that include, making sure dialogue is transparent, there's no surprises, and setting the right tone. I like to do this by having informal discussions with the CFO between committee meetings and addressing, business topics such as new business development, the short-term and long-term financial performance, the ability to anticipate various kinds of risk, encouraging the engagement of the CFO with other audit committee members, and finally, that the CFO is building a strong relationship with the CEO and other executives such that they all respect that the CFO will do the right things. Critical to the success of the CFO is having the right resources. The chair can help serve as advocate for ensuring the right resources, developing talent in the organization, and having a succession plan for all key positions. For example, as audit chair, I recently worked with a first-time CFO who needed to build the quantity and quality of the finance team. So before every committee meeting and in between audit committee meetings, we would discuss his progress regarding the team build out. And then at the start of every audit committee meeting, he would recap his organizational progress. Lastly, as it relates to communicating with investors, engage with the CFO pre and post key investor communications with a constant reminder that integrity and credibility takes a significant amount of time to build, but it can be lost overnight.
You're absolutely so right on that point, Mark. Absolutely. And you've done a great job for us in making clear how critical the audit chair is in driving the success of both the committee and helping the CFO. Thank you. So everyone, right now, what we're going to do is pivot again and focus on what the current hot issues are that an audit committee needs to prioritize. And let's welcome Jeff Kuhn, who is our next speaker. So Jeff, how do you see the role of the audit committee changing and evolving in recent years?
Good morning, Lorraine. So over the last 10 or 15 years or so, the Audit Committee's role has expanded dramatically from its traditional role of financial oversight. It's almost become the dumping ground, if you will, for overseeing all kinds of enterprise risks. Large boards for large companies are frequently now having their dedicated risk committees, but most boards don't. So it ends up in the Audit Committee. The Audit Committee's traditional responsibilities have been to ensure accurate financial reporting and that the finance team is robust with strong skill sets. It's been the guardian of the company's credibility with investors and regulators. It's charged with defining the company's financial strategy and capital structure, when to do financings, what kinds of financings to do, how to manage its cash, what to use it for. If it's a public company or wishes to be a public company, when to look at them, how to manage its profile, M&A strategies, both offensively and defensively, and to make sure that senior management establishes proper controls to prevent fraud and risk. And an example, there's an infamous story of an incident that happened to a public company where the CFO received an email from his CEO, who was en route to Hong Kong at the time, asking him to wire $30 million to a new vendor immediately. CFO got right to it and sent his CEO a confirming email that the money had been sent. And when the CEO landed in Hong Kong, he was stunned to see this because he had not sent that message. The CFO had been spoofed. And the net result was, aside from huge embarrassment, the CFO was fired. The company had significant investor reporting and compliance standards at that point, all of which could have been avoided, pardon me, by proper internal controls and procedures. So newer responsibilities for the board are managing the company's non-financial enterprise risk. Typically, this encompasses the field of cybersecurities and capabilities, oversight of various kinds of insurance, from liability to D&O and everything else, legal risks, and managing the company's whistleblower program.
I think pointing out all the newer responsibilities to the audience, Jeff, was terrific, particularly with regard to cyber risk. And for the audience, the example that Jeff gave with regard to the Hong Kong example, that's what we call fidelity issues, which are now a whole insurance management product with insurance companies. So something to keep in mind. So thank you, Jeff, for that. So what are you seeing, Jeff, in terms of the most common current issues that the audit committees are confronting today? What problems does an audit committee help solve for the board and the company?
Well, pardon me. Enterprise risk runs to physical risks. Mark alluded to those earlier: fire, flood, earthquake, and so on, but it also includes pandemic risk. Regulatory risks, companies get themselves sideways with regulators at their great peril. Liability insurance for D&O, which is A, B, and C, side A insurance. IP management. IP is something that's often ignored or overlooked by companies, that figuring that they have a patent, that's all they need to do, which is not the case. You have to enforce your patent and guard it. And all you need to do is look at the kind of litigation that can arise from this in the Oracle and Google debate that went all the way to the Supreme Court. A robust cybersecurity program, including a social media policy. It's now common for companies to have dedicated employees to manage the company's social media profile and commentary. The Audit Committee chair ensures that the cybersecurity program is on the committee agenda regularly and that oversight is continuous, and that usually there's a deep dive into this topic, at least semi-annually. Monitoring the company's profile and reputation in social media. And the Audit Committee oversees the cyber risk by setting expectations of management for accountability and ensuring the adequacy of resources and funding, and the hiring and engagement of third-party experts and firms, consultants, and so on. And lastly, the whistleblower program. Companies ignore this at their peril. They need to have a well-managed whistleblower program. And finally, managing the external auditors, selection of the auditor and fee negotiation for the annual audit, communications with the outside world for investor communications. These all have to be tightly scripted and rehearsed beforehand, and new accounting standards, which happen all the time.
That was a great primer, Jeff, for the audience in terms of what the issues are that an audit committee needs to focus on. So thank you. So now, audience, we are going to pivot again. And Ron Fior is going to tell us about how a CFO should work with an audit committee and how that CFO can then manage up correctly with the board. So welcome, Ron. You've been in a CFO role in both private and public tech companies for over 30 years in Silicon Valley. So when it comes to managing the CFO's relationship with the board, and in particular with the audit committee, what would you point to, Ron, as what we call best practices?
Thanks, Lorraine. I believe the keys to a CFO being successful in dealing with the board or audit committee really fall into 4 areas. The first area is really preparation. And this comes in many forms, including setting of agendas for both the board and the audit committee side. If you think about it, on the board side, you want to work with your CEO, you want to make sure the right financial metrics and the information are presented, and also be seen to be participating in the strategic side of the business. On the audit committee side, you really want to make sure that you're working with the audit committee chair and make sure that all the areas of corporate governance are being addressed and that they understand which ones need to be addressed. Another important part of preparation is information and data. You really need to make sure that you've researched, you pull together all the information on the meeting topics. And that doesn't mean giving the board everything. It means making sure you have the knowledge and the access to the information if it's needed. Another very useful thing that I found is doing a Q&A, preparing a Q&A list. So what I really, on almost all my meetings, I make a list of every question that I can think of that they might ask, and then I actually draft answers to those questions. It really helps so that when they ask a question, you've got the answer at the tip of your tongue, and it really helps build credibility. I think the second key to success is really communication. I mean, we all know that acronym, keep it simple, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. In my comment on preparation, I said that you don't want to give the board everything, and that's really important. They don't want to have spreadsheets and all that kind of other stuff. What they want to do is they want to understand the key issues. They want to know what's important. So you really need to know your audience. And you have to remember that these people are generally people, they're all very successful, but they have a mix of background and skills. You need to be able to think about what the relevant details are and just keep the answer focused and simple. Another part of the communication is you really want to tell the business story. You don't want to read slides. You don't want to recite numbers. You really want to tell them what's happening in the business and why this is the results. Another piece of preparation or data side is the pre-reads. And the communication side is the pre-reads. And what that means is you want to give these board members time so that they can actually get up to speed. And it's going to make all the difference in the world the next day or 2 days after, when you actually go into the audit committee meeting and you're talking about a topic and they can ask smart questions and they can understand what you're saying. And I know this is difficult. It's always hard because there's all kinds of time pressures, but you really, really got to make sure that you try hard to get it there a day or so beforehand. The third key to success, I believe, is participation and how you participate in the board and the audit committee meetings. In the board meetings, it's a tricky one, and it's dependent on your CEO and how the board mix is and how much the CEO wants you to speak. But I found that if you think and you pay attention and you understand and you learn how to lead a conversation when it's important to lead a conversation, and other times to just participate and speak up when necessary, it really sends the board the message that you're thoughtful, and when you do really speak, it's really important for them to pay attention. It kind of helps build gravitas. In the audit committee meetings, as we all know, you're probably running the audit committee meeting. that's generally what happens.
Absolutely.
You know, and again, here you can gain credibility, you know, for you, your team, and the company, and actually provide an opportunity for mentoring growth when you involve your senior team members. Now, you got to make sure your team's well prepared, because that's you don't want them to come in there and, you know, and be asked questions that they don't understand the answers to, or that they haven't prepared. So, you know, it's really, really important that you do that. One of the things, I mean, I found that this has been very, very useful for many of my senior finance teams. This was the first time that they had any exposure to the audit committee or board. I've gone into lots of companies where they've just had no exposure. And so this is really important, and it's actually served them well, as a number of them have gone on to become CFOs in their own right. The final and fourth key to success, in my opinion, is pre-meetings with the audit committee chair. Mark made comments about this earlier in his commentary from an audit chair point of view, but you really want to make sure that you're doing regular check-ins. And what do I mean by this? And I think it's a pretty broad answer here. You need to build a strong relationship. You really need to get to the point where the audit committee chair looks at you and says, hey, I trust this person. They're transparent. They're a straight shooter. That's really, really important. And how you do that, though, is you have to make sure that you're talking to them on a regular basis. I always have a monthly update call. I update them on the business. I bring up any areas that we might be considering, or we should be considering, for the upcoming audit committee meeting. Now, I will point out one thing on this. You have to make sure that your CEO is fully aware of these calls, what will be discussed, so there's no surprises and they don't have any worries about what you're having a conversation on. I mean, they get sensitive about this thing, so you have to be very careful about that. Finally, you really should schedule an audit committee pre-call. And what I mean by that is you want to take the deck a day or two beforehand and go through it in detail with your audit committee chair. And the reason I say that is you want to make sure that you're aligned with them and that they understand the content. Very, very often you will see in a board meeting that the board members will defer to the audit committee chair for their thoughts and then concur with them. An example of this that I've encountered more than actually a couple of times is when, if any of you have done a convertible debt offering prior to this last year, will remember how difficult it was to explain to the audit committee, let alone the board, that the debt was going to be split between an equity component and a debt component. And you're going, and oh, by the way, they're going to move up and down as the year goes, as the years go on. Fortunately, the rules have changed. However, I can tell you, it was a huge help for me having my chair up to speed before the meeting and able to lend his agreement to my presentation. It really, really makes a difference. So if you keep these four areas in mind, I think you'll be seen to be credible, you'll be knowledgeable, you'll be seen to be knowledgeable, and I think you're going to be well on your way to having a successful board and audit committee relationship.
Those were great first-rate insights, Ron, and in particular, the whole concept of the absolute need for a CFO to build trust with his audit chair. And that's by, as you said, being prepared, communicate frequently, and issue alignment. So completely agree with you. So great insights. So thank you. So our final discussion with today's audience is a topic that is extremely timely, and it's all about how an audit committee should act in crisis. So joining us today for this part of the discussion is Ken Chow. Welcome, Ken. So the board's audit committee plays an important role at any company when it faces a crisis, right? Pandemic, product recall, a steep drop in stock price. So I know, Ken, you've seen this play out a number of times over the course of your long career. So tell us a little bit about how and why the audit committee plays such an important role when it comes to crisis management.
Well, thanks, Lorraine. Yes, like Mark said, and also Jeff, risk management is a major concern for audit committees. And how do you manage that crisis is all about risk management and managing the downside. Now, I was reading the article the other day, and Harvard had quoted and pointed out that 65% of all CEOs have experienced a crisis in the last 3 years. And That was before the pandemic. I would probably argue that 100% have
Now
before the
100%.
pandemic. But interestingly enough, 73% expect to go through a crisis in the next 3 years. So, I believe that every company needs to really be prepared for a crisis because it's going to happen. It's more challenging today, more than ever. What used to take maybe 2 or 3 days or even weeks to hit the wire now hits the internet in seconds. And so there's more pressure on CFOs, audit committees, and boards in general to manage crises, maybe when you don't even have the facts and they're still emerging. So expectations have never been higher when it comes to management teams and boards to act quickly in order to restore confidence when a crisis hits. So it's really important that boards and management have clearly defined roles when managing crises. Management has to coordinate the response, provide appropriate and timely updates to the board, have a clear strategy around communication, as Jeff had mentioned, with media, shareholders, employees, and other stakeholders. But the interesting thing is that boards also are responsible for all the oversight and identifying the underlying issues and providing guidance to management. So in my experience, that the companies that are most successful in navigating crises are those that have made an effort to really build trust with all of their stakeholders, including their investors, through engagement, responsiveness, and feedback over time.
Totally agree and totally get it. So just moving on, Ken, what do you believe are the practical steps that a company can take with its audit committee to proactively make sure they're prepared for a crisis when one actually occurs?
Well, there are a lot of steps, but I'd like to probably point out to 3 really important ones. And I know Mark had touched upon, but this is where the CFO can really lead the charge and to take over with the audit committee chair, lay the groundwork for managing a crisis. The first, I would say, is identifying the risk and the areas that are most likely or have the greatest potential to create a crisis at a company. And this may be different from company to company and industry to industry. Audit committees and management, they really need to react quickly to reduce the potential for a major crisis. And ultimately, management, audit committees, and the board will be measured by how proactive they were in the oversight of identifying that risk and the mitigation before the crisis happens. I was talking to audit committee chair the other day, and one of the things he said is, like, what are the most likely risks that the company could face? What's the playbook for those scenarios? And as Jeff pointed out, there's a number of different challenges for audit committees these days in this environment. I think Jeff had said, listed off a number of them. It's really a wide swath, whether it be fraud, and we talked about cybersecurity, which I have a real example of, inappropriate conduct by management, product liability, natural disasters, and the list goes on and on. But I actually experienced a situation where I had a crisis. It was a security breach for a company that I was doing work for, and we had just tokenized all the PII information. It was an e-commerce company, and so no sooner than maybe 60 days after we had finished that control work and really tightening up our systems, did we get a sniff around our network. We had detected an intrusion. Someone was just sort of sniffing around. But lo and behold, guess what? We had the guys with the black cases and the sunglasses, trouncing in, and it was a pretty intense 72 hours. And the great thing is we did have a plan, and so we started to kick in all the contingencies. How do you communicate and so forth? So I think one of the things that made it easier was that we had actually gone through a dry run. Okay, what if we get a breach, given that it's an e-commerce company? So I think the best practice is for management and boards to run through simulations and really walk through the most likely scenarios so that it's not the first time through when a crisis hits.
Great point.
The second step, I would say, is really preparation. And I think Mark touched upon this a bit. Some might say that crisis management the plan is a lot like insurance. You really never need it until you do, and a crisis hits. So the audit committee and the management team really need to consider a number of key issues. What are the most likely risks? How can a company best mitigate and resolve really in general? Who owns the crisis management program? There's got to be a focal point, someone who really owns it. What role does management play versus the board? Who's responsible for leading the team? And really what triggers the team into really kicking into gear and acting on your plan? When a crisis hits, one of the specific, what's the specific process to assess the risk and the potential impact? What third-party domain experts do you need to bring in? Like in my example, we had the cybersecurity guys walking in, but oftentimes it's PR firms and who specialize in crisis management and so forth. So when to kick those third-party domain experts? And last but not least, what are the communications? How should you engage with your key stakeholders? What's the prioritization? What's the plan for engaging investors? And the last one I would say, and I'm going to close with this third step, which is, okay, now you're in the crisis. Something's happened and you're thinking, okay, what do we do? The great thing is if you've done a great job of identifying risk and establishing a solid plan, you just kick in all your contingency plans. And we saw that, and I'll cite an example in a second, this last year. You focus on your communications, your public relations, investor relations, internal communications, because your employees are also uncertain and they want to know. The domain experts, whether it be government, regulatory sometimes, and you really have to safeguard all the assets of the company because it could have a material impact, if not even bankrupt your company if it's significant enough. Let me take an example of this last year. I was working with a company, pandemic hit. We all 2020 was a challenging year. And this company had operations in India and also Colombia. And so what happened in India, for example, is the Indian government actually shut down the country. And so really limited, and what's going on in India right now today, it's the same thing and even worse. They've shut down everything. And so the good news is that the company had a contingency plan, a business continuity plan per se. The bad thing is the government shut down the country, but we were able to shift to a work from home strategy, really seamlessly and minimized any disruption. The capacity for processing in that company, the transactions got cut by 75% overnight within a span of 24 to 48 hours.
Wow.
And so the ability to be nimble really helped minimize the impact, and the company started to do well again. Bottom line is, crisis is a true test of what management teams are made of, and the audit committee is a huge part of that.
Those are great examples, Ken, real life examples of what can go wrong and then what to do right. And it sounds like the bottom line for you is have a plan, prepare, and do simulations, right? Be ready. Totally get it. So that was great, Ken. Any final thoughts that boards and management teams might benefit from when it comes to audit committee effectiveness during a crisis? Any last pearls of wisdom?
Yeah, I think just a couple of things here that I'd like to leave the audience with. Having a strong track record of engagement with your investors and stakeholders is a critical foundation for any board or executive team, including the audit committee, when you want to manage their crisis. When a crisis occurs, keep a couple of things in mind. Own the problem or the issue. Have the corporate courage to take the responsibility. Don't try and duck it. Just be open and transparent and own it. Execute to your plan. If you've done a great job of really contingency planning, pay attention to all the details and then go and execute just like we do in our normal businesses. Don't overreact. It's a moment of truth for management teams and audit committees as well as boards. And be transparent. It will further credibility and trust, not only at the moment, but really going into the future. Here's an example, and I think many of us today can relate to. Tylenol had the container tampering crisis. They did some things really well in that crisis. It was a tough situation. It hurt their business. It hurt their stock, but they owned the problem. and they overcorrected, but they didn't have to. They pulled all the bottles off the shelves, and now all the containers, they made a difference in the industry. Now all containers have plastic seals, which it didn't used to, and they survived as a company, even though in the short term, they took a hit on their stock. It came roaring back. So I just advise everyone, remember, anyone who's been through a crisis knows that a crisis has a pretty long tail, and people remember. So how you prepare, execute, and communicate is what investors will remember.
I can't agree more with that. And I do think that if you communicate or over communicate with your investors, and you do it frequently, investors will stay with the stock typically. And that's what I think happened with J&J. So I think that's a great example. So at this point, we are done with the discussion part of the webinar today. I think you all did a fantastic job in kind of giving our audience what I would call a primer as to how to maximize audit committee effectiveness. We have about 10 minutes for chat. And so I'm going to go into the chat room now, and let's see what our questions are. So Dave Arnold, who we know well, charters for audit committees seem to be cookie cutter. Do you see significant differences in charters for different companies? And maybe Mark, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Sure. And Dave, good to have you on this. I don't think they necessarily start out being different. A lot of times you can get a charter from, your outside counsel. You can go on the internet, you can look up people's charters. But what I have found is over time, they do change. So stage and size of company will have an impact. Public or private, obviously, will have an impact. In what I said earlier about self-evaluation, you may find when you do that self-evaluation that there's something that was just missing or lacking in the charter, and you'll update your charter once a year as well, and you'll put that change in. So yes, on the one hand, they probably start out as cookie cutters, Dave, but over time, I think they get very specific to making sure that the company can meet the obligations and responsibilities in the charter as it relates to their business.
Thank you, Mark. I think the next question, perhaps Ron, this is the role
Oh, sorry.
What do you
Sorry.
think, Ron? Yes?
Yeah, so I can talk about the role.
Sure.
Generally speaking, I've not actually seen the controller actually have meetings separately with the audit chair. On the other hand, if you have an internal audit company, if you have an internal audit group, your head of internal audit will definitely have meetings with the audit chair independent. And sometimes, look, if you're a smaller company, you probably have somebody who's managing your SOX, who's managing the SOX process, and you might have a director of SOX and internal controls in those areas. That person would generally meet with the audit chair on a regular basis, and I think that's appropriate. So that's really, I've not actually run into, maybe the other guys have run into something where a controller actually does it, but generally I don't see that happening.
Anyone else might have a comment there about the role of the controller?
The only thing I'll add to what Ron said is that as part of succession planning, if you have a really strong controller and has really high potential, it's really important to, and this goes not just for a controller, but for other positions, it's really important to get that interaction with the chair as well as other audit committee members. And the only other thing I would say to committee members as well as a chair is, just don't show up at the meetings, visit the company. And when you're there, interact with, not just the finance organizations, but people within the organization. You'll learn a lot through that process as well.
The only thing I would add is that, excuse me, I think giving your controller a lot of play time in terms of being at audit committee meetings and all of that good stuff is very, very important for succession planning, as Mark said, and just as Ron said, being a good CFO. I would say it's odd if the audit chair meets with the controller without the CFO in the room. It doesn't happen that much. Typically, it happens with both the CFO and the controller. But in my opinion, if the CFO is comfortable with it, then why not? But it is typically not done. And again, the controller and CFO should be very in sync with regard to how they deal with the audit committee chair. That's my own 2 cents. Let's go to the next question, and I'll open it up to the whole panel. How soon in advance of an IPO should a company hire an audit chair? I know a lot of you have thoughts about that. So Ken, do you want to start? Can we start with you?
Sure, absolutely. I think that it's got to be at least a year. It doesn't bringing in an audit chair, as you're getting ready and prepping for an IPO, I think that's too late, because the audit committee chair needs to understand the company, what the issues are, and they're usually quick studies. But I think getting into the depth of the company's business and what the key issues are, it's hard to do in a couple of months with a handful of interactions. So if I would advise every company that if you're thinking about it, at least a year, if not longer than a year ahead of time, because you want all of your ducks in a row when you're getting ready to go.
Does anyone else have any comments on that?
Well, I agree 100%, but it isn't just the audit chair, it's the whole board. It takes time to recruit a competent and well-functioning board, and the company really needs to focus on building a post-public board a year before it goes public.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff's comment there too.
Totally agree. But what happens, guys, if there's just not time? Meaning, particularly in today's market, right? There's SPACs all over the place that want to take operating companies public through the de-SPAC process. A lot of people are thinking the market is frothy now, let's go. So it may not be where they had the year to think about it. So if it happens more quickly, any advice to somebody who's just jumping in to an audit committee chair seat? What are the things to look for?
Yeah, I think you're touching on sort of the current environment and reality we're living in. IPOs have been hot for years. SPACs are around. I think ideally you'd like to have that chair on board before you file your confidential S1 or your initial filing of the S1. Later than that becomes dicey. So I would, sometime in advance of the filing, whether that's a couple of months, and then you have to expect people to get up to speed. But that's sort of the current reality that we live in. Ideally, if you could plan, a year in advance, that would be best. But I think in the world we're currently living in, you want them on board before you file that S1.
I would agree. I think it's really important. If I was coming onto the board and I was going to be the audit committee chair, I'd be really hesitant to just jump on and, I'm going to have to sign off on the S1, with a week's notice or a month's notice. I mean, boy, you're going to have to do some really heavy studying and spending a lot of time with the controller and the CFO and people to try to get understanding of the business, because you're going to be looked upon on that. There's going to be people relying on you.
To echo that, it isn't just what the company needs, it's what the audit chair needs. And if the audit chair has, it's got a 0 to 60 problem, I got to get speed right away. Honestly, you're not going to get the best talent to act as audit chairs because they're not going to accept that level of risk. They need more time to get comfortable with what's going on in the company.
All great points, guys. We have one more question, and that is, how can the CFO influence management and the board to select the right members for the AC? I see too many AC chairs that have limited or no financial and accounting experience. I personally don't see that, but that's a great question. And does anyone want to answer that question?
I'll take a shot at it, at least initially. So, this is an incredibly important partnership, the CFO and the audit committee chair. And so if you're a sitting CFO and you're out recruiting for an audit committee chair, it's like any important position. You should think about what the criteria is, what you're looking for, what that chemistry looks like, how that working relationship's going to be, because you're going to sit together in quote unquote the foxhole of a public, potentially a public company, if not a private company. And both of you are partners in basically being held accountable at the highest levels for the financial part of the business, as well as other parts, as we've talked about. So I've been in a couple of different situations. I've had a lot of influence on who we selected, and I think it's critical, and you should insist upon it if you're a CFO.
I'm just going to jump in here, and then I want to hear the views of others. I could not agree with Ken more. I've typically been in earlier stage companies, pre-public, no intention of going public, where it's a couple of VCs that are on the audit committee, and they're there just to have an audit committee created. And I've been asked by the CEO many times, hey, Lorene, can you help me figure out some good independent members to add to the committee that do have financial skills? I think it changes when you're closer to going public, or getting much, much larger, where you have to have a very established audit committee. The audit committee chair has to be somebody with financial expertise, but oftentimes, right, the other committee members may not, and that can be sometimes tricky. Anyone else have a point of view?
My experience has been exactly like yours, Lorene, in that most of the time there are some pretty good people that are, I have, at least my experience has been very good people. But I have to admit, I have always been asked in every company, in my last probably 5 companies, I've always been asked to participate in that process of interviewing the audit committee chair, just to make sure and to get my opinion. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I think it's the right step for a chair to engage with the CFO about the audit committee. Now, sometimes it may already be in place, but as you're, changing the audit committee and the succession planning, and I touched a little bit on that, making sure you have the right composition, the right skill set on the committee. And if that does mean growing it a little bit, you should consider that.
Could not agree with you all more. So I think that's a wrap for today's session. First, thank you, panelists, for participating in our meeting today, and thank you, audience, for joining us. I just want to mention one thing as an audience reminder, and that is to please go on our website and register for our fall CFO workshops. We have 2 workshops. They're full-day workshops. They'll be live at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco. One is October 14th. The next one is November 18th. You can register on our website, and they're going to be great, I believe, discussion and study sessions. So please join us on those 2 dates. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks.
You.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.